Okay, this is one of our sessions actually that came as a special request from some of you as I was looking at journals. Some of you mentioned it might be, I don't know why I'm not getting any sound. I think it's the other mic. You can hear me all right though, can't you? Oh, yeah. One of you in your journals mentioned about maybe it'd be great to learn a little bit about some of the saints. And so I said, well, why not? I think it's a good opportunity. In the church, we have a special day for celebrating the saints. It's called All Saints Day. Pretty easy to remember. It's on November 1st. It's a day that we're asked to go to church together. And but actually, throughout the year, every day is kind of every day is designated for a particular saint, actually. So there's a saint day. As you're doing a little research, which you will as part of your confirmation, picking your name for confirmation, you will be asked to learn a little bit about the saint that you choose, and chances are most of the saints that you choose potentially will have a saint's name to it. So, as you know, we're going to keep going back to that theme. I know you're getting sick of it, but it's just to kind of throw this all together of the toolbox. And we've been talking about some of the tools in the toolbox, and so far we've covered a few of them, like prayer. We've talked about we're going to be talking about sacraments. We're going to be talking next session about the Bible, all the tools in the toolbox. But one of the most important tools I think that we can find in this toolbox of building our faith is the example of the saints. Because on the day of our baptism, all of us started at the same spot, the saints and us. We were baptized into Christ. So from day one of our baptism, all of us were sharers in the same opportunity that we today honor the saints who followed that guidance of the Spirit in their life. Having heroes in our life is something very common in our culture today. So you have, Tom Brady perhaps for some of us, for some people. Even though he switched teams, he's a hero in some respects, a sports hero. And if you have different people, like for me, I'm old, but as a musician and as a keyboardist, my hero was Elton John. Your parents or probably grandparents talk about him. I'm finally going to see him in concert in July at Gillette. But they're people we look up to. So I look up to Elton John musically to see his creativity. And when I watch him play, he's so passionate about how he plays that when I was learning keyboard, he was kind of one of my inspirations. And perhaps if you have people, whether it be a sport you might relate it to, or in music, or in dance, in studies too, we can look at certain people and say, that person inspires me to be the best version of myself, or whatever talent that I share with that person, which is very small compared to the person that's our hero, but they inspire us to reach our potential. And so for us, as on our spiritual journey, the people who should inspire us, and they should inspire us by their life, and to get to know them a little bit, we can see a lot of our life in their life. Now, they've made it. The word saint comes from a Latin word, sanctus, means holy, which means set apart. And even though we might call them saint, holy, set apart, anything that's holy doesn't necessarily mean it comes from another planet. So if you go into church and you take water, I don't know if you see that when you enter into church, the holy water, and you make the sign of the cross with it. All right, that water didn't come from another planet. It's water just like water you're drinking. The difference is I bless that water, and it makes it holy, makes it set apart from the water that I drink in the bottle. So it still comes from natural, still it's the same substance, but by the fact that we bless it, we make it holy, we make it set apart. And the same can be said about ourselves. We're no different, and you're going to see that the saints are no different from any other person. But at some point in their journey, they gave their life to the Lord, and by doing that, they cooperated with God's grace, which is that you can get and I can get. When we receive communion, we receive God's grace. When we're baptized, we receive God's grace. So, in a sense, we're called to be set apart, not to be weird, not to be from another planet, but we have a special mission. You guys have a special mission that some of your classmates don't have. Because if you are followers of Christ, if you are taking your faith seriously, if you're going to be confirmed in your faith, you are setting yourself apart than, say, some of your classmates who might be very good people, but for whatever reason, they're not setting themselves apart. And that's the call to holiness that we have. Now, what I want to do is go through some of the saints, some that you know, and some perhaps you don't know. You certainly, or I think, would know St. Peter. St. Peter was chosen by Jesus, one of his apostles, and he was called to ultimately lead the church after Jesus returned to heaven. So Peter had a real special role in the early church. Jesus chose followers, chose apostles to follow him, but he put one kind of in charge of them all, and that's St. Peter. St. Paul was also one of the followers of Christ, but he accepted his mission a lot later, actually after Jesus had died and returned to heaven. Because Paul's first experience of Jesus was not walking side by side. He saw Jesus in a vision, and it was after Jesus returned to heaven. And so Paul's call to serve the Lord wasn't just because he was one of his disciples that walked with him 2,000 years ago, but he had that special calling. And with that special calling, he had a certain mission. And his mission primarily, where Peter in the early church, the mission was to take, because they were of the Jewish faith, and the early church was taking the Jewish people and showing them the new way. That's what Christian means, the new way. And it was a movement. It was a movement. Paul's mission was to the Gentiles, and those would be the people who were not Jewish, people who had no connection to the Hebrew faith. Okay? So they had different missions and different callings. Throughout history of the church has been around now 2,000 years. Throughout the history of the church, there have been men and women and young people who have made the decision to follow Christ. And that should be, those people, inspirations for us. If we're being called to follow Christ, then it's great to be able to look at someone or some people who say, well, that would be great if I could be somewhat like that person. In the early church, a lot of the followers of Christ were martyrs. And what a martyr is someone who died for Christ. They were willing to give their life for Christ. And so in the early church, you have some saints, For example, Saint Cecilia, whose feast day, remember I told you every day is a different saint. Saint Cecilia lived in the year 176 AD, just a couple of hundred years after Christ was present, who was willing to die rather than to sacrifice to the pagan gods. Now, the pagan gods, again, that was a different type of religion, and they were forcing her. The early couple of hundred years in the church were brutal. They were brutal. So we can't even fathom this. Maybe someone, and probably even that now not, but maybe someone might make a comment because you go to church or you're being confirmed. Maybe they'll make fun of our faith and make fun of you because you're following the faith. I don't think any of you have been threatened to be killed because of your faith. And yet the majority of the early Christians, if they followed Christ, they were putting themselves out there to be killed. As a matter of fact, for the first couple of hundred years, at least 150 years after Christ, the Christians would gather in secret places. They didn't have churches. They didn't have, come to this church, or I'll go to St. Elizabeth, or I'll go to St. Anthony. They had no church. Their churches were like in cemeteries. They gathered secretly, or in the catacombs, which were like the underground cemeteries. So they were very, very susceptible to being killed. Cecilia was one who died rather than being told, you got to sacrifice pagan worship. Saint Sebastian was in 288, and he was an athlete, known as an athlete, and he was persecuted and killed for his outspoken defense of the church. But then when Christianity became legal and accepted in the 4th century, early 4th century, many to this day, even though they are no longer many people after that persecution in the early church, were no longer killed for the faith, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen even today. There's a story, Nazarene. I want to tell you a little bit about this. First of all, it's estimated today that 11 Christians are killed each day simply because of their belief in Christ. Simply because they are a follower of Christ. Now, this happens frequently in places like North Korea, Iraq, Afghanistan, where Christianity in some sects of that area are not permitted to exist. You can't be a Christian. You're not allowed to be a Christian. As a matter of fact, there's an organization, and this is Nazarene.org, whose work today is to support persecuted Christians throughout the world. They use as a symbol of their organization, they use this, what is an Arabic letter for N. And the reason why they use this symbol, this organization to help persecuted Christians, that to this day, you have some of these countries that don't allow Christianity, that they'll go to the house. They'll go to a person's house that they know a Christian, and they put this symbol, N, Nazarene. Why do they do it, Nazarene? Jesus was from Nazareth. So they put that symbol, they paint it on the house to say, these are one of them. So this is happening today. It really is. But the reality is we don't have to die, or seldom are we going to be called. I've been around a long time. I've never been threatened to die because of my faith. I've been made fun of because my belief in Christ, and certainly my role as a servant in the church. But I've never been threatened with, I'm going to go out to kill you because you're following Christ. But you don't have to die for your faith in order to be a saint. You just have to live your faith. That's what makes a saint a saint. Not someone who just dies for their faith. There might be part of it, but it's living for Christ. And I want to give you a couple of other examples of people who lived their faith and tell you a little bit about them. These are kind of common ones that you know, or you might have heard of. St. Francis of Assisi. He lived in the 13th century. He was a rich kid with a very wealthy family. And as a kid, he wanted nothing more than to be a famous soldier and a prince. And he had the pedigree about him that he could be. But then he gave up, at some point, all the riches in his family to serve the poor and serve the sick in this small town in Italy known as Assisi. He gathered a group of other like-minded people in poverty who wanted to serve others in poverty and service, and he formed this religious group that we call, to this day, the Franciscans. So he had such a passion for serving Christ in the poor that he gave his life, gave up all of those possibilities of luxury and being a prince so that he could follow the Lord. And then a friend of his named Claire, notice also from the town of Assisi, she followed his way. So this was almost unheard of at those days. It was the men that were kind of following this order. But then she wanted to do it too as a woman. And he said, okay, fine. And she started an order of women following the same rule of St. Francis, known as Clare. Some people who are connected with St. Francis would first of all be St. Anthony. Our church here in East Falmouth is named after St. Anthony of Padua. Where's Padua? It's in Italy. And even though St. Anthony actually was Portuguese, he was from Lisbon, he ended up settling in Padua, Italy, and that's where he served. And he served the poor and the needy in that small town. And he was a close friend of Francis. He was a contemporary of Francis, and he was very smart too. So many of Francis' followers that were joining his order, the Franciscans, Francis would send them to Padua, to Anthony, to teach them about the faith. In 2013, Pope Francis was elected. And when a pope is elected, a pope, that's not his name. That's not his name. He chooses a name. And the name he chose was Francis. And no one had ever chose. There's 267, I think, popes that have been since Peter, going back to Peter, who was the first pope. He was the first one to take the name Francis. And if you look at his ministry, everyone kind of has their specialty or special focus. If you were to study anything about Pope Francis, you would discover a couple of things. First of all, his particular compassion and love for the poor, and also his respect for nature. And if you look at St. Francis and you look at his life, you'll see that he parallels the life of St. Francis in the same way. As we're beginning to learn about saints, so that we will be making a choice on a saint that we want to kind of choose, not only for confirmation, but someone that we can look up to. That's how you make your choice. You kind of learn a little bit about the saint. What's some of the things you like that you focus on? Are you a musician? Are you involved in sports? Do you have a particular compassion to working with the poor and needy? You know, some people do, some people don't. So that's the way we kind of come to, I think, a decision. And I think that's what happened with Pope Francis, is he always, as a priest, and then as a bishop, and then as a cardinal, he had a particular compassion and love for helping the poor and needy. And so for him, it was kind of, I think, a no-brainer that he take the name Francis. If we look at our churches here in Falmouth, already I mentioned about St. Anthony. As I mentioned, a priest from Portugal. Then he ended up settling in Padua. Then we have St. Patrick, who, of course, is the church downtown. Most people think that Patrick was Irish, because everything is, all the Irish say, oh yeah, he's an Irish. No, he converted the Irish. He was actually British. His story is great. He was kidnapped when he was 16 years old by Irish raiders, and they held him in captivity for 6 years in Ireland. And then after he got released and he returned back to Britain, he entered a seminary, was ordained a priest, and then he decided to return to Ireland, the place that had held him captive, because he wanted to bring the faith of Christ that he had learned. He wanted to bring it to the people who originally had held him captive. And that's why Patrick is associated with the Irish, because it was really by his incentive that Ireland converted to the Catholic faith. And then, of course, as you know, up the north end, we have St. Elizabeth Seton, who was the patron of our church up there, was the first American saint. So that's a great distinction, and I'm so glad that, when they founded St. Elizabeth Seton Parish, now almost 50 years ago, that they chose the first American saint, and I think it's the second parish. I don't think it's the first, but I think the second parish in the United States that was named after Elizabeth Seton. So it's kind of interesting that you have here at St. Anthony, which used to be primarily a Portuguese parish, a lot of people that came from Portugal and the islands settled here in East Falmouth, that they named their church to honor a Portuguese saint. Downtown, when they named St. Patrick's Church, a lot of the people who founded that church were Irish immigrants. And then in the 70s, much later, when they established a new church, a third parish in Falmouth, that they named it after the first American saint. And she wasn't even Catholic initially, Elizabeth Seton. She converted to the faith. And she was married, and then she had 5 children. But then after her husband died, she started a school for girls and started, and through that, shared her faith with others. Then we have down on the heights, St. Thomas. St. Thomas is named after Jesus, one of Jesus' 12 apostles, and we're told from the Gospels that after Jesus died, 3 days later he rose from the dead. Some of the disciples saw him. He appeared to them. Thomas wasn't around, and it's the great story of Thomas. He said, oh, come on now. I'm not going to believe this. He'd followed Jesus for 3 years. He was so hurt by the fact that Jesus was killed. And he had put so much into it. And now he has his friends saying, he really came back from the dead. And they said, yeah, right. And he didn't believe it until a week later when he appeared again and Thomas was with him. Thomas is a great saint, I think, to be named after if you're picking a name when sometimes we feel doubt, not certain about things in our life, maybe problems that we've dealt with in our life. I think Thomas is a great person. And then, of course, we have St. Joseph now. St. Joseph, as you know, is the name that we chose for our 3 churches coming together as one. We added the name Guardian of the Holy Family just as a reminder to us that Joseph's mission was primarily to Jesus, but also to Mary as well. And it's also the name of the church in Woods Hole. But saints, now I'm talking about all these people who lived centuries ago. All right, so you say, okay, that's old people. But the reality is, now of course I'm old people too, but the reality is I've personally met two saints. I met two saints. They weren't saints at the time, or I didn't know they were saints at the time. The church hadn't declared them saints at the time, but since their death, the church has recognized them as saints. And I think you might recognize that's Mother Teresa, and that's a younger version of myself that I met Mother Teresa, believe it or not, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And that was back in 1995. And then this is me meeting Pope John Paul II, who was a pope for many years, and that's me meeting him around the year 2000. St. Teresa, or Mother Teresa, as you know, worked with the poor, the poorest of the poor in India in the 20th century. She had such a strong love and devotion to the poor that she'd go out into the city. She'd gather people in India, because there were a gazillion people living in India, and in the poorest cities, Calcutta, and they're just, as they're dying, they just put them out in the street. So they're like at the street corners, they're on the side of the road. She would pick them up and gathered a group of religious sisters that had the same vision. She would pick them up and bring them to a building, and she would do that just so many of them died, but she wanted them to die with dignity and respect rather than like a dog that was put out to die. And that was what she gave the dying. Sometimes she treated them and they didn't die, but many of the people that she ministered to ended up dying. But they died with dignity, they died with love, they died with Christ by their side. So she was tremendous. She was also a strong defender against abortion, and equally devoted to caring for babies as well as for those who were dying. She just had a great respect for the person, for the human person. So much so that soon after she died, I think she died, 1999 maybe, right around that time. It wasn't too many years that this Pope declared her to begin the process of becoming a saint. And then John Paul II was the Pope for 27 years. He was from Poland, and he grew up during the Nazi invasions of World War II. He also was a very strong defender of the dignity of human life. He was a brilliant scholar. He was an actor in college. He didn't start in a seminary, but he loved acting. And some would say, if you do if you like history, that he was part responsible for the collapse of communist Russia and its grip on parts of Europe in the 80s. But what I remember, one of the things I remember most about John Paul, there's Mother Teresa, there's John Paul. This is the picture that gives me the greatest impression. I actually have a picture of this in the confessional upstairs where I hear people's confession. This man is named Ali Akka. In 1980, Pope John Paul was having an outdoor audience at St. Peter's. He was in the square, and generally the square has about, maybe 10,000 people in the square. I was a student in Rome at the time, so I was there. I had a ticket to go to that audience. And I'm walking down towards the square from where I lived, which was maybe about 5-6 blocks away from St. Peter's, and people started running in the opposite direction. They were like a madhouse of people running because I had missed it, but earlier I was running late. Hard to believe, but I was running late, and while in that square, when the Pope first came out, this man shot him. And he almost did not make it. He was in the hospital for weeks. Then he got an infection, and he was in the hospital for another month or two. And they caught him immediately. Because, I mean, he was surrounded, and the guy had a gun. And they just swarmed him, and they caught him. This is Pope John Paul, 1 year after he got shot, meeting with the man who shot him. I couldn't do that. I mean, someone talks bad about you and you'll never talk to them again. Or you try to beat them, get back at them by calling them names or talking bad about them. He's sitting with the man and standing with the man who shot him. And that's one example of many, many ways that John Paul showed that holiness, that being set apart. Now, we've talked about old saints. We've talked about less than old saints, contemporary saints, people that I knew. But one common thing in all of these saints we've been talking about is they're all older people. And they had what you might say as a kid, what's this have to do with me? They're old. And they had many years to kind of work out being a saint. I'm going to introduce you to a few young people. First of all, Maria Goretti. Now, she lived in the 1800s and was one of the youngest people ever to be canonized. At the age of 12, she was attacked by a neighbor who tried to rape her. She resisted, saying, "Don't do this to me, this is sinful. God does not want it." The man began to choke her, and it stabbed her 11 times. She died the next day. Devotion for this young saint arose immediately because she became someone, a hero, a heroine, to look up to particularly young people that were trying to resist sexual immorality. And that they looked to her and said, if she can do it, if she can not give in, I need someone to be that model and example. Well, anyhow, the man was arrested. He did time. He was released from prison. And he asked for forgiveness of Maria Goretti's mother. Pope Pius XII canonized her in Rome in 1950. And at that Mass, the man who did that to her was at the Mass and watched the canonization of this young girl. Francisco and Jacinta Mato. Those, if you remember, if you've come to Mass here at St. Anthony, there's the picture of Mary on the back wall of the church, and there's 3 children at the bottom of it. Well, 2 of them are canonized saints, and they died when they were just a little over 10, 12 years old. But they were so devoted to our Blessed Mother that after the apparitions and thousands of people were coming, people looked at them in their young life and saw the purity and saw the beauty of faith. And they changed the lives of so many people just by their example. They're not, they are, I think for some, there's different ways, this is what I'm trying to say, there's different ways, different paths towards being a saint. You don't have to be murdered. You don't have to be old and spend a lot of time working this out. You don't have to be a religious leader in the church. Even young people can do it. And then I have two more that I want to talk about, because even though we're talking about young people, we're still talking about a long time ago, 1800s, early 20th century. Two more I want to talk to. And to do this, could you, well, I'll do that afterwards. One of them is this woman. Now, we don't call her Saint Chiara. We call her blessed. And what the church means by that is they're not quite officially declared a saint, but are on the path to sainthood. If mentors want to pass out just that one to the... Now, at the age of 4, Chiara seemed aware of the needs of others. She would sort out toys, 4 years old. And she would look at her toys and say, there's poor people, poor children that don't have any toys. She gave them toys. She invited less fortunate people into the family home for holidays. She would visit retirement homes for the elderly. She loved to go to Mass. She loved reading the gospel. She had a lot of friends. She played sports. She loved to sing and dance. She didn't preach to her friends about Jesus. She just tried to bring Jesus to them by the way she lived her life. When she was 17, Chiara learned that she had a very serious form of bone cancer. The treatments were painful, and unfortunately, they weren't successful. In spite of the pain while she was in the hospital, she would offer to take a walk with other patients to give them support. When she could no longer walk, she wrote letters and sent messages to others of hope. She gave all the savings that she had, she didn't have a lot, but she had some, to a friend who was going to be a missionary in Africa. When her life was nearly over, she said, I have nothing left, but I still have my heart, and with that, I can always love. Kind of a little bit of what I was saying in the homily today. It doesn't have to be always things, just ourselves. She died at the age of 19. The other one that you can pass out, the other card, his name is Carlo Acutis. He was actually born in London, England in 1991 to Italian parents. And the family, even though he was born in London, the family moved to Italy, in Milan, where he spent the majority of his life. He had a passion for computers, for playing soccer, video games, and ice cream. But also at a young age, he had a great love for his Catholic faith, and in particular for the Eucharist, for communion. And I think this is so important to stop and think that maybe you think nothing of what you did upstairs today, and you come up like everyone else comes up and you receive communion. He had a longing for it, a longing for it. He received First Communion like many of you did when he was 7 years old. He started going to Mass regularly, didn't have to be told, didn't have to be forced, didn't have to be part of a confirmation to go. He went because he loved it. He would receive communion every Sunday, and then he started going to Mass every day. A kid about your age. He, as I said, had such a love for computers, and he was good at programming, that he made a website with stories of different miracles in the past 2,000 years that involved the Eucharist. He described the Eucharist, what we receive on Sunday. He described it, this is my highway to heaven. Said that as a kid about your age. Another thing he said that I really like, all people, now, he could only do this in this generation. No one before this could say this because they didn't have it. All people are born as originals, but many die as photocopies. Let me say that one again. All people are born as originals, but many die as photocopies. In other words, they lose who they are and just follow the crowd. They move to not die as photocopies, but in order to do so, we need to focus on God. He was gifted in the world of computers. At 11, excuse me, he created the website for Eucharistic miracles. But then in 2006, not a long time ago, 15 years ago, he was 15, more or less your age, maybe a year older. He was diagnosed with a very aggressive form of leukemia. And then he soon died. So at this point, Carlo and excuse me, and Chiara haven't been officially declared saints, but soon you're going to see, I think both of them will be saints as well. So what can we learn from these holy people spanning 2,000 years? Well, who is the next saint? Who could be the next saint? It could be an old person. It could be a person who's part of a leader or official in the church. It can be a young person. It can be someone very well known or someone not known at all. But the thing to keep in mind before I turn it over to Julia now is that the saint possibility, and I know it's hard to believe, and probably your parents would think it would be even harder to believe, and maybe I would find it very hard to believe, kind of, is the possibility there for you as well? And here's the answer. If you have been baptized, the possibility is there. It's now cooperating with the grace that God gives us. Just like the saints, the first step was our first step, baptism. The second, like them, we have the same tools. The same tools we've been talking about. Prayer, Bible, sacraments, living in the world. The same tools, examples of faith to follow. So could you be? Yes.